On this episode, I spoke with David Kadavy. I have been a super fan for at least a year, and in preparation for this episode, listened to hours and hours and hours and read 2 books to prepare for this conversation. David, what was this conversation like for you?
I feel seen. You were incredibly prepared for it. It was an honor that you did prepare so well for it. And it was amazing to hear some of the things that I had written years ago that you picked up that I had forgotten about.
This episode is brought to you by 2 books, Mind Management, Not Time Management by David Kadavy, and Conversations, How to Manage Your Business Relationships One Conversation at a Time by yours truly, Ivan Farber. For more information, visit conversations.biz or kadavy.net. Both books are available on Amazon, Audible, and Kindle. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Conversations About Conversations. On this show, we talk with movers, shakers, and difference makers about the meaningful conversations that they lead in the world. Our guests are business leaders, authors, speakers, podcasters, and more. Today's guest is David Kadavy. David is the author of several books, including 2 that I've read and 2 that I'm about to read. The 2 I've read are Mind Management, Not Time Management, and How to Write a Book, an 11-step process to build habits, stop procrastinating, fuel motivation, quiet your inner critic, bust through writer's block, and let your creative juices flow. And it did all of those things for you, David.
Awesome.
David has had a podcast since 2016 called Love Your Work, what he calls his intellectual playground. But here's the thing that's amazing to me, and I'm going to ask him about this. He's had amazing guests, including CEOs, authors, and true thought leaders such as Seth Godin, David Allen, James Altucher, Ryan Holiday. He has a newsletter called Love Mondays, which of course is an interesting thing. Not everybody loves Mondays. Before becoming an author and a podcaster, he had a successful career in Silicon Valley in graphic and web design. He has a Bachelor in Fine Arts in graphic design from Iowa State University. He was born in Omaha, Nebraska, an actual neighbor of Warren Buffett's. And he currently lives in South America. He's the first guest from South America. He lives in the country of Colombia. Please help me welcome to Conversations About Conversations, David Kadavy.
Ivan, thanks for having me. It sounds like you know more about me than I do.
Well, David, I like to give every guest an opportunity to make an opening statement. And to preface that, I would say I've either read or heard you speak thousands and thousands of words into these ears and this brain, and I've gotten hundreds of what I think are tremendous ideas from you. Well, the members of my community don't necessarily know you. So as a part of an opening statement, I invite you to share what you're about and what are like the main important conversations to you that you're leading.
Oh, wow. And once again, you probably know more what I'm about than I do myself. I'm really just a creativity fiend. I always want to be creating. I'm a huge fan of all modes of expression and art, and the process through which people make that happen, the process through which people discover what it is that is uniquely theirs and how they bring that into the world. And so that's something that I'm doing myself, but at the same time trying to share what I learn as I try to do those things and as I study what others do to make that happen. And so I guess the conversations that I'm having, one is Love Your Work. That is my podcast. And I think it confuses a lot of people because they think that I'm going to teach you how to love your career, or that it's going to be something that some Fortune 500 company I'm going to do consulting with or something. But really, it's kind of a message to myself to try to find that feeling of curiosity, that feeling of joy in the process of doing work, in the process of creating. The other one I think is mind management, not time management. I think that our world is obsessed with time. And I think that time is something that is so deeply embedded in our culture as this sort of God value, as this resource that is an input that is going to give you an output. And I would like to for us to rethink that. We have lost touch with our creativity, and we have lost touch with how can we discover what it is that we have to offer the world and turn that into something that nobody's ever done before. And that's tough when you've grown up following the curriculum, filling out the bubbles with your number 2 pencil so that you can get the degree to get the job doing the thing that somebody already knows how to do. I'm more interested in how we do things that we don't know how to do, and that we're not sure, as Seth Godin says, that we're not sure that this might not work.
I learned about you about a year ago, and it was the title Mind Management, Not Time Management, that attracted me. And it wasn't because I saw a billboard in Times Square, although we can talk about that. Sure. But this is the way we get connected to people in this world. Like some thought leader that I follow made a comment, and you commented on a thread, and that led me, and this just fascinates me, that led me to then follow you and buy your book, and then subscribe to your newsletter and podcast and all of that. And all of that happened because of social media. I mean, this is a positive thing versus all of the vitriol that goes back and forth.
Here we are.
Yeah, and here we are talking. But you just said something a minute ago that I want to pick up on in my second question, which is most people believe that you have to hustle harder, use more elbow grease, and better manage your time in order to be successful. When you say that it's actually mind management that counts, which I'm completely in agreement with you, but what I want to know is, how did you come to this unconventional point of view?
I think for me, it started when I wrote my first book, which is a position very few people find themselves in, where they have a book deal and a contract and they've been paid some money and they've got a deadline. But, I think we all have to manage with deadlines and do things that we're scared and not sure how we're going to do. And I had cleared away so much of my schedule. I fired my clients. I cut out my social life. I just locked myself in my apartment by myself for 6 months. What I found was, hey, I have all this time, but I'm spending most of the day not writing. I'm spending the most of the day sitting at my keyboard, hunched over in pain. And then every once in a while, I'll get that 15-minute burst where suddenly I output an entire chapter. And I found myself asking myself, well, why couldn't I just sit down and do that 15 minutes of writing and get on with the rest of my day? I started to look at the patterns that I saw in how I was arriving at those 15-minute bursts of productivity. And I was starting to realize that there are ways that you can set up your energy and your use of your energy so that you work almost like a perpetual creativity machine, where the energy that you have used in one thing has gotten you to a place that creates the potential energy that can then be released in doing the next thing. And to tie that to something larger, why it's important now and why people think, oh, you need to manage your time very, very well to make it in this world, which is true to some extent. I think that's like a foundational element, but we're in this extremely high leverage world. As Naval Ravikant says, there's 3 types of leverage. There's labor, there's capital, there's media. You're leveraging media right now. So you have this podcast, you've got all these listeners, you have people like me coming onto this podcast, and it's something that you do in addition to all the other things that you do. But it's an extremely high, it's extremely high leverage thing, and it's the potential of the leverage is outrageous, because there's really no limit to the number of people that could end up listening to your podcast. Case in point, somebody like Joe Rogan with millions and millions of listeners. His podcast is not technically a whole lot different from yours. You're having people on who you want to talk to, and you're asking them what you're curious about. And that wasn't something that was possible all the time. So if you're using media just as an example, which I think is that's the type of leverage I think that is the most available to people. Some people have access to capital. Some people are good managers, or they're talented at it or something. But everybody can get on Twitter and type something out that, Bill Gates could read, or that millions of people could read. So if that is what you're doing, then it's not so much important that you're able to write your tweet really fast, or that you're able to write a lot of them in a short amount of time. I mean, that might be a tactic that you might use, but what is important is your idea. How good is your idea? Because you're using a lever. And if we think about this for the people who are watching on YouTube as a lever, you got a fulcrum, and then you've got your sort of seesaw lever. And if you move that fulcrum way, way over, you've got a really long lever. And, just by moving a tiny bit on one side, you can make it move a lot on the other side. But that also increases the amount of force that's required to get that lever to move there, just some sort of basic physics. And so if that force needs to be increased, then the quality of your ideas need to increase by that much. How are you going to increase the quality of your ideas? It's not going to be because you do something faster. You can type a novel in 8 hours, something like that, a novella, 30,000 words. You can sit down and type that in a day. Can you write a novella in a day? Most of us can't. Even if you look at NaNoWriMo and people who are writing a novel or a novella in a month, most of them don't turn out too good. It's not so much the speed at which you are able to execute a thing that is going to be the difference between your success and failure in this world of high leverage. It is going to be the quality of your ideas.
What led you to start the podcast?
I think I just wanted to learn from people, and I was searching for examples of what I hoped to do myself, which was to find this thing that was kind of uniquely mine, that was uniquely resonant with myself, and turn that into a living. And it was a pattern that I had kind of seen in other people, as evinced by the guests that I chose, but I wasn't quite sure how to make it happen myself. And so I think I was looking for a little bit of that learning and confidence boost. At the same time, also a big motivation for starting it was there wasn't a podcast out there, I don't think, that was exactly like it. Like there were podcasts that I really liked to listen to at the time. My favorite ones were the Tim Ferriss Show, and James Altucher's. And Tim Ferriss's value proposition, I think, is still like top performers. And then James Altucher's was peak performance. I loved those shows, but there was something about those value propositions that did not align with my values, in that I'm not necessarily that interested in peak performance or top performance. I'm more interested in unique performance.
We create this content, but unlike a shopkeeper who you lay out your wares and you can see people's reaction to what you're selling to them, you don't know it. And the mistake I get trapped in every time is you do it by number of views or number of likes.
Yeah.
And that doesn't indicate the quality or the impact of what you're doing. I mean, I've gotten a great guest because a PR person saw it, and maybe it had 7 views, but then it led to a guest that has gotten thousands and thousands of views, but it's a trap, like to make it meaningful to me because it has a lot of views.
Yeah, I think one point there is the number of views that something has, and who is actually reading it is so important. There's certainly, pages on my site that tons of people have seen that haven't had much impact, and there's pages that not many people have read that have a lot of impact. People reach out to me, or they invite me on their podcast, or I end up having dinner with them or something because just those few things. I also think that when you do work and you put it out there and it's still out there working for you, that's kind of that media leverage that I was talking about. It's sort of like these little robots that are out there sharing your ideas that you put out there years ago, and they continue to do work for you. And that's really amazing. And so that's one of the things I love about being on a podcast like this, where you have read so much of the work and listened to so many of the podcast episodes and also prepared very diligently for the conversation, is that it does give me an opportunity to remember some of the stuff that I've done, because that is sort of my process, is I'm trying to put stuff out there all the time and sort of see what comes back to me. It's like, if you love an idea, let it go by putting it out there. If it comes back to you, then it's an even better idea. And this is something I actually do. It's a little embarrassing, but I will re-listen to my podcast. But it's actually an awesome reason to have a podcast. Even if nobody listens to your podcast, it's a great way to review your own ideas. And you listen to stuff from years ago where you realize, oh my gosh, that is totally relevant to something that I'm working on right now, but I didn't know it at the time when I was creating that, and I wouldn't know if I hadn't revisited it. It took me a long time to realize what it was that I wanted out of my podcast, and so I don't know if that's clear to you or not, what you want, or
no,
or you're just kind of doing
it's
stuff.
ever evolving.
Yeah.
It's just ever evolving. And that's one of the things I like about it. And sometimes I feel like I'm evolving in front of people and I shouldn't in public evolve in front of people. And then other times I feel like there's a great void.
Right?
There's this great void, and I don't know if anybody's paying attention to what I'm doing, but you just never know. It's like when you throw a pebble into a pond, things ripple out and one thing leads to another. And
yeah.
I
think don't be afraid to evolve in front of people too, because it's like, it wasn't fun to publish income reports where I was making $2,000 or losing money in a month or whatever. But the way I see it is just, you go to see a movie, like there's going to be a point where the villain's got the hero like hanging over the side of a building or whatever. And so even though it sucks at that moment where you're looking bad, or so to speak, it makes it that much cooler, like when you recover and throw the villain off the side of the building.
Good point.
Now that I'm like reporting $10,000 months or whatever, I think it's probably a lot that probably makes the story more interesting, especially the people who've been reading since the income report, since I was reporting 2,000, or you like you said, you listened to my first couple episodes and I'm like, I'm so scared, I'm like not confident.
But how do you get those, what I would consider to be amazing guests?
Yeah.
How do you get them?
So Seth Godin was somebody who I started following maybe 2004, 2005, reading his stuff online, reading his blog. I've got emails dating back to maybe 2007 with him, where like maybe I made a thing on my blog that was like, you could donate $1 and then you would get to see a picture of a puppy. And I like sent him an email like, hey, look, this is so cool, isn't it? Because I got this idea from, your Purple Cow, or I was just inspired by sort of Seth Godin things. And, he, lo and behold, he wrote back like, oh, that's very nice, David. And, he responds to pretty much every genuine email he gets, or, especially back in 2007 or so. And just over the years, when I first started my podcast, I invited him. And he said no. And then just, I was still at it another year later and I invited him and he said no. And then I was still at it, I think maybe another year later. And I invited him and he said yes. And that's episode 77. And I don't know, maybe it was getting close to 2 years at that point, a year and a half. And I asked him during that conversation, like, what's different this time? Why did you say yes? And, he made it sound like it was this random thing. If I can recall right, when I'm looking for a big guest like that, I'm thinking about who is that guest connected to that maybe most people don't think is a big deal, but that you also admire. So for example, for me, that was Hugh McLeod, who was super internet famous in like the late aughts or so with his cartoons on business cards, and who also illustrated one of Seth Godin's books. So I know that was at least one of the guests that when Seth Godin said yes, I'm pretty sure in my pitch email, I said, hey, I've interviewed this person, Hugh McLeod, right? Which might make his ears perk up. I have nothing but theories here, but that is something that I do. I don't know if I do it intentionally, but it's something that just sort of happens naturally from really being into somebody's work, is that, oh, this other big person who is into this, not as big or popular, not as big of an audience person, they're into that person's work as well, but that's because you share values with them somehow. I mean, I think it's really easy to get into this trap where you're trying to get a big guests on your podcasts because they're big guests, and that somehow that's going to increase the number of listens that you get. And I think it's very easy then to start going after guests that are big just because they're big and not because like you get it. I think that's another thing that I try to do when I send a pitch to somebody like Seth Godin, is like, you try to find this statement, like a one sentence or one few words that you could say that illustrates that you know what they're about. And it's not exactly something that they've said before, but you know that if they read that statement, that they know that you know them. But that's something that I go for when I would go for a guest like that. And then also timing things with what's going on with them. So for example, one huge guest that I got I was so nervous to interview, and then a lot of people won't remember, is Steve Case, because he started AOL, and like, he was just a god to me. And he was launching a new book. And so I pitched to have Steve Case on my podcast, thinking no way he's going to be on my podcast, but he was. And I was so nervous for that interview. But I think timing, making it about them, making it about what's in it for them too. So demonstrate that you are dedicated to this. Demonstrate that you are into the same things that they are, as evinced by the guests that you've had before that they might already be connected to. Demonstrate that you know what they're about by saying a statement that shows that you understand exactly what's important to them. And then also think about what's in it for them and try to time things so that they benefit from it somehow, such as if they're launching a book and you say, hey, I have this audience, I've interviewed these people, and I would love to help you promote your book. Not, I would love to interview and have you on my show. I would love to help you promote your book.
A very thorough answer. I'd like to do a lightning round. I want to say a concept that came from either your book or your podcast, and have you make a quick comment about it. And the first one that I'm going to say is, make your bed, change the world? ?
Yeah, so that was a question that I asked all my guests early on, was, do they make their bed? Because you've heard this advice like, who is some general or something. If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed. Well, it turns out like a lot of people don't actually make their beds. And so I still make my beds a little bit, but I don't actually like made beds. I don't like it when it's tucked underneath and all that stuff. So, you just like smooth it out. I do think that it's somewhat useful, but it also doesn't matter.
Next concept, reading books in layers.
Yeah, a lot of books, especially a lot of mass market business books, you can read in layers. Look at the table of contents, try to understand what each chapter name is trying to say. find a chapter name that is compelling to you, jump right to that chapter, look at the headings for it, maybe look at the first sentences of a few paragraphs and act accordingly. You can actually learn a ton from a book in 20 minutes.
Who wants to be a billionaire? Not me.
Yeah, I guess I had this time in my life where I realized that I thought that I would be a billionaire, which I think a lot of people think. So I made it a point to write a little article about how I actually don't want to be a billionaire, because I don't. That's not, I don't want anything that would be required to go along with that. And if I had $1 billion, I'm not sure what I would do with it.
Give yourself permission to suck.
It's very easy to get stuck up in perfection paralysis. Perfectionism is basically refusing to start the journey until you've actually reached your destination. And if you give yourself permission to suck, to actually do poorly at something, then oftentimes it turns out much better than you expected. It actually gets you started as well. And you can't get good without first being bad.
Last one of the lightning round, which is one that I know you could speak for a lot more than lightning round on, but moving to the third world for a better life.
Yeah, I question the assumption that living in America, that life has to continually get better there. People came to America for a better life from other places, and it's not unreasonable, if you are an American, to search for a better life in other places. I have found, after moving to Colombia, I've found a better life here. And it's a hard thing to even consider, because we think of America as the place everybody wants to live. But if you think about what is important to you and what's not quite so important to you, you can find the right mix and find a place to go. And I know it's hard to move, but people have done it throughout history for various reasons. And a lot of times they didn't have a choice. So if you are intentional about it, you can make the life that is best for you.
You write a lot about yourself, and you give full disclosure about your finances and your business results. Like, you have an episode where you talk about, I did book pub and lost $4,000. How easy is it for you to be so self-revealing about things that a lot of people wouldn't share?
Not easy. It is scary to put in public all your financial information, as I do in my income reports. It's especially scary to do it when you're not doing so well, as it was for the first few years. And I've started to do a lot better in the last several months. But that's a feeling that I'm constantly trying to remind myself to crave, because that I find makes the most interesting content, is when it's vulnerability, I guess, is the buzzword, right? Is that, which I think is not quite the right word, because vulnerability states the idea of vulnerability is that you are open to being harmed. But I think it's actually the opposite. It feels vulnerable, but it's actually anti-fragile or resilient.
Now, I've never done Patreon, but you have been talking to me through your podcast about Patreon for a long time. I don't want to insult you by like signing up for Patreon and doing like $5 a month or something that seems kind of, although it would be like coming to Colombia and buying you a cup of coffee.
I don't think that's insulting at all. But you can buy a lot in Colombia for $5 too.
So I'm intrigued. So that is not insulting, like,
no,
with Patreon.
No, that's why there's levels for $3, $5. Each dollar that I get from Patreon feels like 10, because it's somebody pledging money that they don't have to because they like the work that I'm doing. And even though it's a small fraction of my income, I continue to do it. And I think that it's a good vote of confidence that I'm moving in the right direction, because it's something that helps me make a little extra income as I'm working on a book, which, you know, a big book is only going to come out every couple or 3 years. So it always means a lot when somebody pledges on Patreon, and I try to pledge for the creators that give me that feeling as well.
Well, you've done a lot for me, and so it only feels right for me to do that. I want to ask you a final question here. It's an opportunity for a closing statement in this conversation. What do you want people to do as a result of them listening to this conversation?
I'd like for them to take the first step, the tiniest step toward that pie in the sky project that they've been putting off. Let's say it's a book. Say you've been thinking about writing a book and you are confused about exactly how you would go about it. Go to kdp.amazon.com and sign up and try to upload a book. And maybe you don't even have to publish it, but you can upload a 500 Word document. If you want to, you can publish it under a pen name and you can actually see it up on Amazon and make yourself a cover and stuff. That'll at least get you familiarized with the process of writing a book. And that's a very tiny step that you can take.
Well, I got here from a number of tiny steps as well. So I'll echo that. James Clear's newsletter is how I got started writing. A friend of mine sent it, and perhaps that's how we got connected on Twitter. And I started writing, and it was just a weekly article to friends by email. But even then, I had to like move my hand over to the mouse to hit the send button. And I stressed about sharing it, maybe at first with like 15 people. And then I started publishing it on LinkedIn and a little bit on Medium, not as much as you did on Medium, but a little bit on Medium, like a really little bit. But LinkedIn was the place that I was playing. And then I said, well, I'm going to write a book. And so I wrote a book, and that took me 2 years. And I was determined to do it in 1 year. Like, I'm one of those people, and maybe I'm not going to stay one of those people, but I've been one of those people that says, I'm going to do it by December 31st. And I didn't. It took me a whole full another year before it came out. And my book came out in November of 2018. And then they tell you, you've got to market your book. And I'm like, you mean it's not just going to sell itself? And I always thought I would go on the speaking circuit. I have a real passion for speaking to groups, but I have a full-time job. I'm not really in a position to just knock on doors of chambers of commerce and Rotary clubs and just go on a speaking circuit. I was on a podcast and I liked it, but even then I resisted immediately creating my own podcast. But the resistance level is so little because yes, you can buy a cheap microphone and record on your laptop and you have a podcast. You just need to take that loop. Most people have an average of 3 episodes and then they stop. And that's why there's like 4 million podcasts out there. But like my podcast is a top 10 podcast, and mostly it's a top 10 podcast simply because I've stuck with it for 275 episodes.
That's awesome.
And it just keeps going. And I wanted to acknowledge you for that encouragement, just to echo it, that it's really important to have people who encourage you to just take that incremental step and take a risk. And you definitely lead by example. And you're so open about it. You've been very meaningful and instrumental to me. So it really is very meaningful to me that you were willing to have a conversation with me.
Wow, that is awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Because, you might think that I hear stuff like that all the time, but no, it's usually just feels like I'm shouting into the void. And I wonder, does anybody listen to this podcast at all? I see the stats, I see the people listening, but you don't always hear everything. So thank you so much for that. And I really appreciate your preparation I guess the preparation has really just been the process of consuming the work.
Well, I turned up the gears on the podcast in preparation for this, but
that's what makes a podcast great, is it helps you get focused for a conversation. Yeah.
Before we conclude, I want to tell you a little bit about my book, because I do realize that the podcast, like for James Altucher, is, I believe, where it's going to start, and building a community and a network of people that are doing like-minded things that are important and meaningful to the world. And so my book that I wrote is called Conversations, and it was the summary of the lessons that I had learned. I work in financial services. I'm a relationship manager, and I have conversations all day. That's what I do. That's what I produce, is the net result. And I've mentored dozens of people, and they kept saying, you should write a book. You should write a book. And I thought I should too. Now, here's what has been written in some of the Amazon reviews of the book. This is one of the best self-help books I've ever read. It's a manual for someone who wants to optimize business and personal relationships through effective conversations. It's relevant for anyone who cares about improving their relationships one conversation at a time. And that's really my focus, is on, you have all these books that are great, like How to Win Friends and Influence People, that are very macro. And where I've approached is, how do you make a conversation such that it meets both of our needs, that it's meaningful, such that you leave the conversation having gotten something from it and are either encouraged or inspired, or there's something created from that. The 1 + 1 is much more than 2. So David, as a thank you for being on the show, I'm going to send you a copy of my book.
Oh, awesome.
And in closing, I want to thank the listeners of the show, but I want to connect with you. That's an invitation. I want you to direct message me on social media, on LinkedIn or Twitter, or email me, ivan@conversations.biz. My long-term dream is to build Conversations University, but on the road to doing that, I'm building a community of people who find conversations meaningful, and they want to make a meaningful difference in the world. With that, David Kadavy and everybody out there, thank you for being a part of this conversation about conversations.
Thanks so much for having me.